Hello, welcome to Crimson Noir.
Important. Hollowmere Road looked its most innocent on the afternoon of the chapel jumble sale. A pale sun rested over the village roofs, the hedges were newly trimmed, and the lane curved past the old smithy with the quiet dignity of a place that believed itself immune to scandal. Miss Marple, who had come to Hollowmere to visit an old school friend, sat beneath the chapel chestnut tree with her knitting in her lap. Around her the jumble sale progressed with the usual mixture of charity, rivalry and concealed judgment. Mrs. Alder arranged chipped china as though displaying crown jewels. Mr. Thomas Vane, the retired schoolmaster, guarded the book table with solemn importance. Clara Denby sold sponge cakes with a smile that vanished whenever certain people approached. One of those people was Mr. Roland Pike. He had returned to Hollowmere only 6 months earlier, after inheriting a narrow cottage near the mere. Nobody liked him, though everyone had a different explanation for why. He was too smooth, Mrs. Alder said. Too quiet, said Clara. Too interested in other people's affairs, muttered Mr. Vane. Miss Marple watched him now as he moved from table to table, smiling politely and touching nothing for long. He paused at the bookstall and picked up a small brown notebook tied with faded string. At once his expression changed. Not surprising. Recognition. Miss Marple's needles still. Mr. Pike slipped the notebook into his coat pocket and turned toward the lane. At that moment, someone called his name from near the old smithy. He looked up. For one brief second, fear passed across his face. Then he walked away from the sale, following the curve of Hollowmere Road. Less than 5 minutes later, a cry rang out. Important. The villagers hurried toward the bend by the stone wall, where the lane dipped toward the mere. Mr. Roland Pike lay on the grass, one hand half closed, his face turned toward the damp earth. The brown notebook was gone. Important. For several seconds no one moved. The scene had the unreal quality of a picture glimpsed before the mind had understood it. Hollowmere Road curved quietly beneath the hedgerows, the chapel bunting fluttered behind them, and beyond the low stone wall the fields sloped toward the mere silver and still under the afternoon light. Then Mrs. Alder cried, "Doctor! Fetch Dr. Lyle at once." A boy from the cake stall darted away toward the village. Clara Denby stood with both hands pressed to her mouth, her face quite bloodless. Mr. Vane, usually so precise in speech and movement, seemed to have lost both. He stared down at Roland Pike as though the dead man had committed some final act of discourtesy. Miss Marple came forward quietly. Mr. Pike lay on his side, one arm bent beneath him, the other extended toward the grass verge. There was no dramatic sign of struggle, no overturned cart, no obvious weapon. Only the curious stillness of a man who had expected one thing and met another. Mrs. Lydia Shaw arrived last. She had been inside the chapel hall when the cry came, and now she stopped abruptly at the edge of the little crowd. Her eyes went first to the body, then to the pocket of Pike's coat. Miss Marple noticed that. "The notebook," Mrs. Shaw said, almost under her breath. Mr. Vane turned sharply. "What notebook?" Mrs. Shaw's face changed at once. "Sack only me and Eth had one earlier, did he not?" Miss Marple looked at her gently, but said nothing. Dr. Lyle arrived within minutes, carrying his black bag and breathing harder than he would have liked anyone to notice. He knelt beside Pike, touched the wrist, then the throat, and remained still for a moment. When he rose, his expression was grave. "He is dead." Mrs. Alder made a small sound of horror, then immediately recovered enough to tell everyone to stand back, though no one had come very near. Mr. Vane removed his spectacles, polished them, and put them on again, as if clearer glass might produce a different result. "How?" Clara Denby asked. Dr. Lyle glanced at the body. "I cannot say yet. It appears suddenly. There is no obvious injury from where I stand." "Then he must have been taken ill," Mrs. Alder said quickly. "A seizure, perhaps. His heart." Miss Marple's eyes rested on the dead man's half-closed hand. "Perhaps," she said softly. Dr. Lyle looked at her. "You think otherwise?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that people very often become ill at inconvenient moments. But sometimes the inconvenience is arranged. A silence followed. Mrs. Alder drew herself up. "Surely you are not suggesting I am suggesting nothing, dear," Miss Marple said mildly. "Only noticing." By then more villagers had gathered at a distance, whispering in careful bursts. The jumble sale had lost all shape behind them. A tablecloth flapped loose near the bookstall. Cups stood abandoned. Someone had left a slice of cake half wrapped in paper. Ordinary things looked faintly indecent after death. Constable Red arrived next, red-faced and earnest, followed soon after by Inspector Merritt from Market Town. The inspector was a narrow, thoughtful man with quiet eyes and a manner that made people answer more truthfully than they intended. He listened first to Dr. Lyle, then to Mrs. Alder, then to Mr. Vane. "And this notebook," Inspector Merritt said at last. "Who saw it?" There was hesitation. Miss Marple spoke gently. "Mr. Pike picked it up from the book table shortly before he walked down the lane." Mr. Vane stiffened. "Important. There were dozens of old notebooks and ledgers there. Donations from attics. I did not examine everyone." "No," Miss Marple said. "Of course not." Inspector Merritt turned to him. "But it came from your table." "Yes, apparently. And now it is missing." Mr. Vane's mouth tightened. "So it seems." The inspector looked toward Mrs. Shaw. "And you knew of it?" She flushed. "I saw him holding something. That is all." Miss Marple observed the quickness of the reply. Too quick, perhaps. Inspector Merritt crouched beside the body and examined the grass near Pike's hand. After a moment he rose holding a small scrap of faded string. "This may be from the notebook," he said. Miss Marple looked toward the chapel green. A brown notebook tied with faded string, a dead man, an empty pocket, and a village full of people who had suddenly become very careful about what they had seen. Yes, she thought. The notebook had not merely disappeared. It had been taken by someone who knew exactly why it mattered. Important. Inspector Merritt did not immediately question anyone further after finding the fragment of string. Instead, he remained crouched for a moment longer, studying the ground where Roland Pike had fallen, as though the arrangement of grass and gravel might offer more than the words already spoken. Then he rose slowly, brushing his hands together with quiet deliberation. "The notebook was tied," he said, "and that tie has been broken, which suggests it was removed in some haste." There was a murmur among the onlookers. Miss Marple stood a little apart, her attention not on the body now, but on the faces around her. Shock, she thought, had already begun to give way to something else, calculation, perhaps, or recollection. People were remembering what they had seen and deciding what to say about it. Inspector Merritt turned first to Mr. Vane. "You say the notebook came from your table," he said. "Do you recall who donated it?" Mr. Vane adjusted his spectacles. "No," he said. "There was a great deal of material. Old books, papers, household accounts. One does not catalogue everything. Yet this item was distinctive. Only in retrospect," Mr. Vane replied stiffly. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Yes, she thought, only in retrospect, but not to everyone. Inspector Merritt turned next to Clara Denby. "You were nearby," he said. "Did you see Mr. Pike take the notebook?" "Yes," Clara said. "He picked it up and looked at it. Then he put it in his coat. Did he speak to anyone?" She hesitated. "No," she said. Miss Marple watched her gently. That hesitation, she thought, had been very small but not meaningless. Inspector Merritt's gaze lingered for a moment, then shifted to Mrs. Shaw. "You mentioned the notebook earlier," he said. "How did you notice it, Mrs. Important?" Shaw clasped her hands together. "I only saw him holding something," she said. "I did not know what it was." Miss Marple's eyes rested on her kindly. No, she thought. That was not quite true. Inspector Merritt did not challenge the answer directly. Instead, he said, "And after Mr. Pike walked away, did you see anyone follow him?" There was a pause. The question seemed to move through the group like a ripple. Mr. Vane spoke first. "No." Clara shook her head. "No." Mrs. Alder pursed her lips. "I was occupied," she said. "I did not observe." Miss Marple said nothing. Inspector Merritt looked around once more. No one saw him speak to anyone else? Silence. Miss Marple folded her hands. because she had seen something. Not clearly, not in detail, but enough. Mr. Pike had turned when his name was called. That had been certain. But who had called him? She spoke softly. It is curious, she said. Inspector Merritt turned to her. Yes, that no one remembers calling his name, she said. And yet we all heard it. There was a pause. Inspector Merritt's expression sharpened slightly. You are certain? Yes, Miss Marple replied. It was not loud but distinct. He looked back at the group. Who called Mr. Pike? No one answered. Miss Marple watched them. It was not merely silence. It was a particular kind of silence, the kind that follows recognition. Inspector Merritt spoke again. If he was called away from the crowd, he said, then he expected to meet someone. Yes, Miss Marple said gently. And that person knew he had the notebook. Yes, Inspector Merritt nodded slowly. Then the removal of the notebook was not an afterthought, he said. It was part of the intention. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, there was a pause. Important. Inspector Merritt looked down once more at the place where Pike had fallen. No signs of struggle, he said. No disturbance beyond the fall itself. Miss Marple's gaze followed him. Yes, she said softly, because he was not attacked in the ordinary sense. Inspector Merritt looked at her. You think he knew the person he met? I think, she replied, that he recognized them immediately, and that recognition mattered. Yes, there was silence. Miss Marple's eyes moved once more across the faces of the villagers, each one composed. Each one is careful. But one had reacted too quickly to the mention of the notebook. One had known what it was, and why it mattered. She folded her hands again, because now, she thought, the matter had begun to take shape. The notebook, the voice, the meeting, all connected. And somewhere within that connection was the reason why Roland Pike had died, not by chance but because something he carried could not be allowed to remain with him. Important. Inspector Merritt did not immediately press the question of who had called Roland Pike from the jumble sale, though it was clear from the set of his expression that the matter would not be forgotten. Instead, he moved a little way along Hollowmere Road, pausing at the bend where the lane dipped toward the mere. From there he could see both the place where Pike had fallen and the distant cluster of stalls by the chapel. If he was called from there, the inspector said, then the voice must have come from this direction. Yes, Miss Marple replied gently. Inspector Merritt nodded. And yet no one has admitted to calling him. No. There was a pause. Inspector Merritt turned back toward the group. Then we must consider that the person who called him had reason not to be recognized, he said. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said. Or believed they would not be. Inspector Merritt's gaze sharpened slightly. You think the voice was familiar? I think it was sufficient, she replied. Enough to make him turn and enough to make him follow. There was silence. Inspector Merritt stepped closer to the stone wall, examining the narrow strip of grass where Pike had fallen. The ground was undisturbed save for the impression of the body and the faint scuff where his shoes had shifted at the moment of collapse. No sign of struggle, he said again. No indication that he resisted. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the same spot. Yes, she said softly. Because he did not expect harm. Inspector Merritt straightened. Then the meeting was not hostile. No, and yet he died. Yes, there was a pause. Inspector Merritt turned once more to the group. Miss Denby, he said, you were near the book table. Did you hear the voice clearly? Clara hesitated. Important. No, she said. Only that someone called his name. Male or female? I could not say. Miss Marple watched her. That answer, she thought, had been chosen rather than recalled. Inspector Merritt nodded slowly, then addressed Mrs. Shaw. And you? Mrs. Shaw's hands tightened. I heard it, she said, but I did not see who spoke. Inspector Merritt regarded her. Did you recognize the voice? There was a pause. No, she said. Miss Marple folded her hands. That, she thought, was not true. Inspector Merritt did not challenge her directly. Instead, he said, it is curious that a voice can be heard by so many and yet recognized by none. Yes, said Miss Marple softly. Very curious indeed. Inspector Merritt looked at her. You believe someone did recognize it. I believe, she said, that recognition is not always something one chooses to admit. There was silence. Inspector Merritt's attention moved slowly across the faces before him. Each one composed. Each one is careful. But one showed a particular kind of stillness, not uncertainty, not confusion, but restraint. Miss Marple spoke gently. It is not only the voice that matters, she said, but the timing of it. Inspector Merritt looked at her. Yes? It came just after he had taken the notebook, she said, and before he had time to examine it properly. Inspector Merritt nodded slowly. Then the person who called him knew he had it. Yes, and wished to intercept him. Yes. There was a pause. Inspector Merritt's expression sharpened. Which means the notebook was not merely an object of chance, he said. It was something expected. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes. Inspector Merritt turned back to the group. Important. Who among you knew that such a notebook might be found among the donations? There was silence. Miss Marple watched them. Because now, she thought, the matter had narrowed. The notebook, the voice, the moment, all carefully arranged. And somewhere within that arrangement was the person who had known not only that the notebook would appear, but exactly when and exactly how to ensure it did not remain with Roland Pike. Important. Inspector Merritt did not press his last question immediately. Instead, he allowed it to hang in the air, as though testing whether anyone might step forward of their own accord. No one did. The villagers stood in a loose half-circle along the lane, each maintaining a careful stillness that spoke more loudly than any denial. It is not necessary to answer at once, the inspector said, but it will be necessary to answer. Miss Marple stood quietly beside the low wall, her eyes resting not on the speaker, but on the listeners. People, she reflected, rarely betrayed themselves when asked direct questions. It was the moments before and after that revealed the truth. Inspector Merritt turned again to Mr. Vane. The donations, he said. When were they brought in? This morning, Mr. Vane replied. Some yesterday. It varies. And were they sorted? To a degree. We separated books from household items. That sort of thing. Inspector Merritt nodded. And this notebook, would it have been examined? Mr. Vane hesitated. Not individually, he said. There was too much. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she thought. Too much for most people, but not for everyone. Inspector Merritt continued. Then it is possible that the notebook was placed among the items without attracting attention. Yes, Mr. Vane said. Entirely possible. Inspector Merritt's gaze sharpened slightly. And by someone who knew it would not be noticed. There was a pause. Miss Marple spoke softly. Or by someone who wished it to be found by a particular person, she said. Inspector Merritt looked at her. You think it was meant for Mr. Pike? I think, she replied, that it was meant to reach him. There was silence. Inspector Merritt turned to Mrs. Shaw. Important. You were aware of the notebook before Mr. Pike took it, he said. She stiffened. I was not aware until I saw him holding it. Miss Marple watched her gently. That answer had been given before. And it was no more complete now than it had been then. Inspector Merritt said, You spoke of it immediately after the body was found. Yes, which suggests it made an impression. Mrs. Shaw hesitated. I noticed it, she said. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her kindly. Yes, she thought. You noticed it because you knew it. Inspector Merritt did not contradict her. Instead, he said, Did you examine the donations at any point before the sale began? There was a pause. Mrs. Shaw's hands tightened. I helped arrange the books, she said. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. That, she thought, was nearer the truth. Inspector Merritt nodded. And did you see the notebook then? Mrs. Shaw hesitated again. I may have, she said. Miss Marple folded her hands. Yes. Now it was clear. Inspector Merritt's voice remained steady. And did you recognize it? There was silence. Mrs. Shaw looked down. I thought it looked familiar, she said. Miss Marple spoke gently. My dear, familiar things are not often mistaken. Mrs. Shaw's composure faltered. It belonged to my husband, she said suddenly. The words came quickly, as though held back too long. Inspector Merritt's attention sharpened at once. Your husband is dead. Yes, and the notebook? He kept accounts, she said. Notes. Notes. Things that mattered. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Yes, she said. Things that mattered. Inspector Merritt said, and you did not expect to see it here. No. Yet you recognized it immediately. Yes, there was a pause. Miss Marple spoke softly. Important. It is curious, she said, that something so important should find its way back at precisely the right moment. Inspector Merritt looked at her. You think it was not a chance? I think, she replied, that it was intended. There was silence. Inspector Merritt turned back to Mrs. Shaw. Who else knew of this notebook? He asked. Mrs. Shaw hesitated. No one, she said. Miss Marple watched her. That, she thought, was not true, because now the pattern had deepened. The notebook had not only been placed, it had been placed with knowledge. Knowledge of its owner, knowledge of its contents, and knowledge of who would recognize it. Miss Marple folded her hands once more, because now she felt quite certain that someone in Hollowmere Road had not only expected the notebook to appear but had arranged for it to do so at exactly the moment when it could no longer be ignored. Important. Inspector Merritt did not respond at once to Mrs. Shaw's admission. He stood with his hands loosely clasped behind his back, considering not only what she had said, but the manner in which she had said it. Then he looked again toward the chapel green, where the abandoned stalls and scattered goods now seemed to belong to an entirely different occasion. Your husband kept notes, he said. Names. Matters of importance. Yes, Mrs. Shaw replied. And you did not expect to see that notebook again? No. Inspector Merritt inclined his head. Yet it was placed among the donations. Yes. Miss Marple spoke gently. My dear, such things are rarely misplaced, she said, particularly when they contain matters of consequence. Mrs. Shaw did not reply. Inspector Merritt turned slightly. If the notebook was placed deliberately, he said, then someone knew both of its existence and of its significance. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. Inspector Merritt nodded. And someone knew it would be recognized. Yes. There was a pause. Inspector Merritt's gaze moved across the group. Who else knew of this notebook? He asked again. Mrs. Shaw hesitated. I do not know, she said. Miss Marple watched her kindly. That, she thought, was not an answer but an avoidance. Inspector Merritt said, Your husband's papers were they kept after his death? At the cottage, Mrs. Shaw replied. Locked away. And who had access to them? No one. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. No one is a very small number, she said. Inspector Merritt glanced at her, then back to Mrs. Shaw. You are certain of that? Mrs. Shaw hesitated. I kept them myself, she said. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her. Yes, she thought. You kept them but not always watched them. Important. Inspector Merritt spoke again. And Mr. Pike, he said. Did he ever visit your cottage? Mrs. Shaw stiffened. Once, she said. Only once. Miss Marple folded her hands. That, she thought, was very interesting. Inspector Merritt's expression sharpened. Vain? Some weeks ago. And why? He said he wished to know more about the village, she replied. About its history. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, she said softly. He was interested in many things. Inspector Merritt said, and during that visit did he see the notebook? Mrs. Shaw hesitated. I do not think so, she said. Miss Marple watched her quietly. That, she thought, was not true. Inspector Merritt did not challenge her directly. Instead, he said, and yet he recognized it at once. There was a pause. Miss Marple spoke gently. My dear, recognition is not always accidental, she said. Sometimes it is prepared. Mrs. Shaw looked at her. I do not understand. Miss Marple smiled kindly. No, she said. But you will. There was silence. Inspector Merritt turned slightly toward the others. Mr. Pike returned to the village recently, he said. He made inquiries. He visited houses. He spoke to people. That suggests purpose. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. Inspector Merritt nodded. And now he is dead. And the one object he carried his notebook is gone. Yes. There was a pause. Inspector Merritt's gaze sharpened. Then we must ask, what did he learn? Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said. That is the right question. Inspector Merritt looked at her. And you think the answer lies in the notebook? I think, she replied, that it lies in what the notebook contains and who would fear it being read. There was silence. Miss Marple's eyes moved once more across the group. Important. Each face is careful. Each expression is controlled. But one showed a flicker of something else. Not fear, but anticipation. She folded her hands. Because now, she thought, the matter had moved beyond chance. The notebook had been placed. The voice had called. The meeting had been arranged. And Roland Pike had walked into it already carrying something that someone else could not afford to leave in his possession. Important. Inspector Merritt did not move for several seconds after Miss Marple's last observation. The idea had taken hold, no longer a suggestion, but a direction. He turned slowly toward the assembled villagers, his gaze passing from one face to another with quiet deliberation. Mr. Pike came here with purpose, he said. He asked questions. He visited houses. He took an interest in matters that may not have concerned him directly. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. Inspector Merritt nodded. And today he finds a notebook that belonged to Mrs. Shaw's husband. A notebook containing names, perhaps records. Something of significance. There was silence. Inspector Merritt continued. He takes it. He is called away. He meets someone. And shortly afterward he's dead and the notebook is gone. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said. Inspector Merritt's voice remained steady. That is not a coincidence. No, Miss Marple replied gently. It is an arrangement. There was a pause. Inspector Merritt turned again to Mrs. Shaw. You said your husband kept records, he said. What sort of records? Mrs. Shaw hesitated. Accounts, she said. Business matters. Personal notes. Miss Marple watched her kindly. That, she thought, was not the whole of it. Inspector Merritt said, and names. Yes. Of whom? Mrs. Shaw's hands tightened. I do not remember all of them, she said. Miss Marple spoke softly. My dear, people do not forget names that matter. Mrs. Shaw did not reply. Inspector Merritt's gaze sharpened. Was Mr. Pike's name among them? There was silence. Then Mrs. Shaw said, very quietly, yes. The word settled heavily. Miss Marple folded her hands. Yes, she thought, now we are nearer the truth. Inspector Merritt continued, and he knew this. Mrs. Important. Shaw hesitated. I believe so. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said. That is very likely. Inspector Merritt turned slightly. Then the notebook contained something about Mr. Pike that he did not wish to be known. Yes, Miss Marple replied. Inspector Merritt nodded slowly. And when he found it, he understood the danger. Yes. There was a pause. Inspector Merritt's gaze moved once more across the group. Who else might have been named in that notebook? He asked. There was silence. Miss Marple watched them. Because this was the moment, not when the question was asked, but when it was heard. Mr. Vane adjusted his spectacles. Clara Denby looked down. Mrs. Alder stiffened slightly. And then a small movement, barely noticeable, but enough. Miss Marple's eyes rested on Mrs. Alder. Inspector Merritt saw it too. Mrs. Alder, he said, you appear to have something to say. Mrs. Alder drew herself up. I have nothing to hide, she said. Miss Marple smiled gently. No one ever believes they do, she said. There was a pause. Inspector Merritt said, were you familiar with this notebook? No. Miss Marple watched her. That answer came too quickly. Inspector Merritt's voice remained calm. Did you assist in arranging the donations? Yes. And did you examine them? Only in a general way. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said softly. General things are often the most particular. Mrs. Alder's composure tightened. Inspector Merritt said, and yet the notebook appeared at a moment when it would be noticed. Yes. And by the one person who would recognize its significance. Miss Marple spoke gently. It is curious, she said, how such things find their way into the right hands. There was silence. Important. Inspector Merritt looked directly at Mrs. Alder. You knew it would be found, he said. Mrs. Alder did not reply. But her silence, it was no longer empty. Miss Marple folded her hands once more, because now, she thought, the matter had shifted again. The notebook had not merely been placed. It had been directed, given to the right person, at the right moment. And the person who had done so was standing very still, hoping that the truth would not quite reach them. Important. Inspector Merritt did not immediately accuse Mrs. Alder, though the direction of his thoughts had become unmistakable. Instead, he took a few slow steps along the edge of the lane, as though re-examining the sequence of events from a slightly different angle. Miss Marple watched him with quiet approval. It was always wiser, she thought, to allow the truth to reveal itself through the pattern rather than forcing it into shape too soon. "You assisted with the arrangement of the donations," the inspector said at last, turning back toward Mrs. Alder. "Yes," she replied, her tone controlled. "And the notebook was among them." "So it appears." Inspector Merritt inclined his head, and yet Mrs. Shaw did not place it there. No, nor did Mr. Vane select it for display with any particular intention. Mr. Vane stiffened slightly but said nothing. Inspector Merritt continued, which leaves the possibility that it was introduced among the items by someone who knew exactly what it was and what it contained. There was silence. Miss Marple spoke gently. "Yes," she said. "And someone who knew it would not be overlooked by the right person." Inspector Merritt nodded. "And that person," he said, "was Mr. Pike." "Yes." There was a pause. Inspector Merritt looked directly at Mrs. Alder. "You knew Mr. Pike before his return to the village," he said. Mrs. Alder's composure held but only just. "No," she said. Miss Marple watched her kindly. That, she thought, was not true. Inspector Merritt's gaze remained steady. "You are certain?" "Yes." Miss Marple spoke softly. "My dear, certainty is a very strong word." Mrs. Alder turned toward her. "I have nothing to conceal," she said sharply. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No one ever believes they do," she replied. There was a pause. "Important." Inspector Merritt said, "Then let us consider the matter differently. You arranged the books. You handled the donations. You were in a position to place the notebook where it would be found." Mrs. Alder said nothing. Inspector Merritt continued, "And you were present when Mr. Pike discovered it." "Yes, and you saw his reaction." Mrs. Alder hesitated. "I did not observe him closely." Miss Marple's eyes rested on her. That, she thought, was not true. Inspector Merritt's voice remained calm. "And yet you heard him called away." "Yes." "And you did not attempt to follow." "No." There was silence. Miss Marple spoke gently. "It is curious," she said, "how one can be so attentive to arrangements and yet overlook a moment of such importance." Mrs. Alder did not reply. Inspector Merritt looked at her. "You knew what the notebook contained," he said. "No." The answer came quickly, too quickly. Miss Marple inclined her head. "My dear, you knew enough," she said. There was a pause. Inspector Merritt said, "You knew it contained something about Mr. Pike." Mrs. Alder's composure shifted, only slightly, but enough. Inspector Merritt saw it. "And you knew he would recognize it," he continued. Mrs. Alder's hands tightened. Miss Marple spoke softly. "Yes," she said, "because recognition is the key to such things." There was silence. Inspector Merritt took a step closer. "You placed the notebook," he said. Mrs. Alder did not answer, but her silence was no longer in denial. Miss Marple folded her hands, because now, she thought, the pattern was nearly complete. The notebook had been placed, the victim had been drawn away, and the meeting had occurred, all arranged, all deliberate, important, all leading to a single moment at the bend in Hollowmere Road where Roland Pike had come face to face with someone who knew exactly what he had done and exactly what must follow. Important. Inspector Merritt did not press Mrs. Alder at once, though her silence had already spoken more clearly than denial. Instead, he turned his attention once more to the lane itself, as though the final arrangement of events might be better understood by returning to the place where they had unfolded. "The notebook was placed," he said. "Mr. Pike found it. He was called away. And then within minute was dead, and the notebook was gone." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. Inspector Merritt nodded. Then we must consider the purpose of each step, he continued. The placement of the notebook, the calling away, and the removal of the notebook afterward. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said. Each part has its place. There was a pause. Inspector Merritt turned back toward Mrs. Alder. You placed the notebook where it would be found, he said. Mrs. Alder did not answer. Inspector Merritt continued. And you knew that Mr. Pike would recognize it. There was silence. Miss Marple spoke gently. My dear, recognition is not a matter of chance. It is something that is prepared. Mrs. Alder's composure tightened. Inspector Merritt said, and when he recognized it, you needed him to act. There was a pause. Mrs. Alder said very quietly, yes. The words settled heavily. Miss Marple folded her hands. Yes, she thought. Now the matter was clear. Inspector Merritt inclined his head. And so you arranged for him to be called away. Mrs. Alder hesitated. I did not call him, she said. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her kindly. No, she said, but you knew who would. There was silence. Inspector Merritt's gaze sharpened. Who called him? He asked. Mrs. Alder did not reply at once. Then she said, Clara. Clara Denby's head lifted sharply. I did no such thing. Important, she said. Miss Marple spoke softly. My dear, you did call him. Clara stared at her. I only asked me to. Inspector Merritt stepped forward. He asked you? Clara's composure faltered. He told me to call Mr. Pike, she said. To tell him someone wished to speak with him down the lane. Inspector Merritt said, Who told you this? Clara hesitated. Then she said, Mrs. Alder. The words fell into the silence. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said softly. Inspector Merritt turned back to Mrs. Alder. You arranged it, he said. Mrs. Alder drew a breath. Yes. Inspector Merritt's voice remained steady. And you knew that Mr. Pike would follow? Yes. And that he would take the notebook with him? Yes. There was a pause. Inspector Merritt said, and when he reached the bend what happened? Mrs. Alder hesitated. Miss Marple spoke gently. My dear, you need not be afraid of the truth now. Mrs. Alder's composure broke slightly. He saw me, she said, and he understood. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, Inspector Merritt said. And then? He tried to speak, Mrs. Alder said, but I told him it was over, that he could not keep it hidden any longer. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her kindly. Yes, she said. That is very often how such things are said. Inspector Merritt continued. And the notebook? I took it, she said. There was silence. Miss Marple spoke softly. Yes, she said. Because it could not be left with him. Inspector Merritt nodded slowly. And his death? Mrs. Alder's voice was quiet now. He fell, she said. I did nothing. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said. That is quite true. There was a pause. Inspector Merritt looked down at the ground where Pike had fallen. No sign of struggle, he said. No force. Important. Only the effect of what he saw and what he understood. Miss Marple folded her hands. Yes, now everything was complete. The notebook, the voice, the meeting, all arranged. All leading to that moment when the past had been brought fully into the present. And Roland Pike had recognized it too clearly to escape it. Important. Inspector Merritt remained silent for a moment after Mrs. Alder's final words. The quiet along Hollowmere Road had deepened into something settled and final, as though the truth itself had drawn a line through the confusion that had preceded it. The villagers stood where they were, no longer shifting or whispering, but simply listening. So, the inspector said at last, the notebook was placed deliberately. Mr. Pike was guided to it. And then he was drawn away where you confronted him. Yes, Mrs. Alder said. Her voice no longer held sharpness or defense. It was even now, almost weary. Inspector Merritt inclined his head. And the notebook itself, you removed it after he fell. Yes, and you still have it. There was a pause. Then Mrs. Alder reached into her bag and withdrew the small brown notebook, its faded string now broken. She held it for a moment, as though its weight had changed, then handed it to the inspector. Inspector Merritt took it and opened it briefly. He did not read aloud, but his expression altered just enough to confirm what Miss Marple had already understood. "Names," he said quietly. "Accounts, records of dealings that were not entirely proper." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said softly. "Things that mattered." Inspector Merritt looked back at Mrs. Alder. "And Mr. Pike's name appears here." "Yes, and others in this village." Mrs. Alder hesitated. "Yes." There was silence. Miss Marple spoke gently. "It is not uncommon," she said, "for such records to exist, particularly in small places where matters are often kept quiet." Inspector Merritt nodded slowly. "And Mr. Pike," he said, "had reason to fear this notebook." "Yes," Mrs. Alder replied. "He had reason to fear it being seen." "Important." Miss Marple's gaze rested on her kindly. "My dear, you did not intend to kill him." Mrs. Alder looked at her. "No," she said. "I only meant to make him answer." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said, "that is very clear." Inspector Merritt said, "And when he saw the notebook one, he understood that it had returned collapsed." "Yes." Dr. Lyle, who had been standing quietly to one side, nodded. "That is entirely possible," he said. "A shock of that kind, particularly when tied to long-held strain, can be enough." Inspector Merritt closed the notebook carefully. "Then there is no evidence of violence," he said. "No act that directly caused his death." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Yes," she said, "because the cause was not physical but personal." There was a pause. Inspector Merritt looked once more at Mrs. Alder. "There will be questions," he said. "Statements to be taken. The contents of this notebook will need to be examined. But as to the death itself, it appears to be the result of sudden shock." Mrs. Alder nodded faintly. "Yes." The tension that had filled the lane began to ease, though it did not vanish entirely. Something remained, something quieter, but more lasting. Miss Marple moved a little way toward the bend, her gaze resting on the place where Roland Pike had fallen. The grass had already begun to settle, the disturbance fading into the ordinary pattern of the verge. "It is a curious thing," she said softly, "how people believe the past can be left behind." No one answered. "But it is not so," she continued. "It waits, and when it returns, it does so with a certain clarity that cannot be mistaken." Inspector Merritt listened. "And what people do in that moment," Miss Marple said, "tells one everything." "Important." She turned back, her expression gentle. "He was not taken by surprise," she said. "He recognized what he saw. And in that recognition everything that had been hidden became visible at once." Inspector Merritt nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "I believe you are right." The villagers began slowly to disperse. The jumble sale would not resume. The tables would be cleared. The day would be spoken of in lowered voices for some time to come. Miss Marple gathered her knitting. Because in the end, she thought, it had not been the notebook alone that mattered, nor even the death, but the quiet truth that had waited unseen but never gone until the moment it could no longer be denied. And when that moment came, everything else had followed, as it always did.